Excuse my appearance. I haven't shaven or combed my hair, but I assure you I'm quite alright. What I'd like to do now is read an essay by Wallace Stevens. I'm not a huge fan of Wallace Stevens' poetry. I find it confusing and overwrought at times. Some of it I like, but I'm just sort of reading this essay whimfully to the YouTube community. So it begins as follows. It goes, Roger Fry concluded a note on Claude, saying that few of us live so strenuously as never to feel a sense of nostalgia for that Saturnian reign to which Virgil and Claude can waft us. He spoke in that same note of Corot and Whistler and Chinese landscape, and certainly he might just as well have spoken in relation of to Claude of many poets, as, for example, Chenier or Wordsworth. This is simply an analogy, simply the analogy between two different forms of poetry. It might be better to say that it is the identity of poetry revealed as between poetry in words and poetry in pen. By the way, the title of this, I don't know why it's not ahead. The title and the table of contents of this particular essay is The Relations Between Poetry and Painting. So, I guess that's what caught my eye. It continues. Poetry, however, is not limited to a Virgilian landscape, nor painting to Claude. We find the poetry of mankind in the figures of the old men of Shakespeare, say, in the old men of Rembrandt, or in the figures of biblical women, on the one hand, and of the Madonnas of all Europe on the other. And it is easy to wonder whether the poetry of children has not been created by the poetry of the child, until one stops to think how much of the poetry of the whole world is the poetry of children, both as they are and as they have been written, how they've been written of and painted, as if they were the creatures of a dimension in which life and poetry are one. The poetry of humanity is, of course, to be found everywhere. There is a universal poetry that is reflected in everything. This remark approaches the idea of Baudelaire that there exists an unascertained and fundamental aesthetic, or order, of which poetry and painting are manifestations, but of which, for that matter, sculpture or music, or any other aesthetic realization would equally be a manifestation. Generalizations as expansive as these, that there is a universal poetry that is reflected in everything, or that there may be a fundamental aesthetic of which poetry and painting are related but dissimilar manifestations, are speculative. That is, those generalizations are speculative. One is better satisfied by particulars. No poet can have failed to recognize how often a detail, apropos, or remark, in respect to painting, applies also to poetry. The truth is that there seems to exist a corpus of remarks in respect to painting, most often the remarks of painters themselves, which are as significant to poets as to painters. All of these details, to the extent that they have meaning for poets as well as for painters, are specific instances of relations between poetry and painting. I suppose, therefore, that it would be possible to study poetry by studying painting, or that one could become a painter after one had become a poet, not to speak of carrying on in both métiers at once, with the economy of a genius as Blake did. Let me illustrate this point of the double value, and one might well call it the multifold value, of sayings for painters that mean as much for poets, because they are, after all, sayings about art. Does not the saying of Picasso that a picture is a horde of destructions also say that a poem is a horde of destructions? When Brock says, quote, "The senses deform, the mind forms." When the senses deform, the mind forms. Just as he is speaking to a poet, painter, musician, or sculptor. Just as poets can be affected by the sayings of painters, so can painters be affected by the sayings of poets. And so can both be affected by sayings addressed to neither. But of course, for many examples, see Miss Sitwell's Poet's Notebook. These details come together so subtly and so minutely that the existence of relations is lost sight of. This, in turn, dissipates the idea of their existence. Okay. That's section 1. I'm just going to keep reading. Not a lot of commentary to give at the moment, but I find it all very, I don't know. Okay. Section 2. We may regard the subject, then, from 2 points of view. The first from the point of view of the man whose center is painting, whether or not he is a painter. The second from the point of view of the man whose center is poetry, whether or not he is a poet. To make use of the point of view of the man whose center is painting, let me refer to the chapter in Leo Stein's Appreciation, entitled On Reading Poetry and Seeing Pictures. He says that when he was a child, he became aware of composition in nature, and gradually realized that art and composition are one. He began to experiment as follows. It's a long block quote. I put on the table an earthenware plate. I put on the table, and this I looked at every day for minutes, or for hours. I had in mind to see it as a picture, and waited for it to become one. In time, it did. The change came suddenly. When the plate, as an inventorial object, a certain shape, certain colors applied to it, went over into a composition to which all these elements were merely contributory. The painted composition on the plate ceased to be on it, but became a part of a larger composition, which was the plate as a whole. I had made a beginning to seeing pictorially, true art in the Paltakian sense. What had been begun was carried out in all directions. I wanted to be able to see anything as a composition, and found that it was possible to do this. He improvised a definition of art, that it is nature seeing in the light of its significance, that it is nature seen in the light of its significance, and recognizing that this significance was one of forms, he added formal to significance. Yeah, and recognizing that this was one of forms, he added formal to significance. Yeah. At times, Stevens is a little, my problem with him, he gets a little vague or something, a little abstracted maybe. Stevens and Frost at one point got into a fight. Anyway, let me just finish reading. Maybe how much longer is this? That was the point. Right now we're at the point that I got to before I decided to start recording and share this. I'll read a little bit further. If it starts to lose me, if I lose the train of thought too badly, I'll just cut it off. Okay. It goes on. Turning to education and hearing, he observed that there is nothing comparable to the practice in composition that the visible world offers. By composition, he meant the compositional use of words, the use of their existential meanings. Composition was his passion. He considered that a formally complete picture is one in which all the parts are so related to one another that they all imply each other. Finally, he said, quote, an excellent illustration is the line from Wordsworth's Michael. Quote, and never lifted up a single stone, end quote. One might say of a lazy workman, he been out there just loafing for an hour and never lifted up a single stone, and no one would think this great poetry. These lines would have no existential value. They would simply call attention to the lazy workman. But the compositional use of Wordsworth, of his line, makes it something entirely different. These simple words become weighted, and the tragedy of the old shepherd, weighted with the tragedy of the old shepherd, and are saturated with poetry. Their referential importance is slight, for the importance of the action to which they refer is not in the action itself, but in the meaning, and that meaning is borne by the words. Therefore, this is a line of great poetry. And never lifted up a single stone, one might say, of a lazy workman. Okay, I think I see the analogy. The selection of composition as a common denominator of poetry and painting is the selection of a technical characteristic by a man whose center was painting, even granting that he was not a man whom one thinks of as a technician. Poetry and painting alike create through composition. Now, a poet looking for an analogy between poetry and painting, and trying to take the point of view of a man whose center is poetry, begins with the sense that the technical pervades painting to such a degree that the two are identified. This is untrue, since if painting was purely technical, that conception of it would exclude the artist as a person. I want to say something, therefore, based on the sensibility of the poet and of the painter. I am not quite sure that I know what it means by sensibility. I suppose that it means feeling, or as we say, the feelings. I know what it is meant by nervous sensibility, as when at a concert, the auditors, having composed themselves and resting there attentively, hear suddenly an outburst on the trumpets, from which they shrink by way of a nervous reaction. The satisfaction that we have when we look out and find that it is a fine day, or when we are looking at one of the limpid vistas of Corot, and the Pays de Corot seems to be something else. It is commonly said that the origins of poetry are to be found in the sensibility. We began with the conjunction of Claude and Virgil, noting how one evoked the other. Such evocations are attributable to similarities of sensibility, if in Claude we find ourselves in the realm of Saturn, the ruler of the world in a golden age of innocence and plenty, and if in Virgil we find ourselves in the same realm, we recognize that there is, as between Claude and Virgil, an identity of sensibility. Yet if one questions the dogma that the origins of poetry are to be found in the sensibility, and if one says that a fortunate poem or a fortunate painting is a synthesis of exceptional concentration, that degree of concentration that has a lucidity of its own, in which we see clearly what we want to do and do it instantly and perfectly, we find that the operative force within us does not in fact seem to be the sensibility, that is to say, the feelings. It seems to be a constructive faculty that derives its energy more from the imagination, from the sensibility. I have spoken of questioning, not of denying. The mind retains experience, so that long after the experience, long after the winter clearness of a January morning, long after the limpid vistas of Corot, that faculty within us of which I have spoken makes its own constructions out of that experience. If it merely reconstructed the experience or repeated for us our sensations in the face of it, it would be of the memory. What it really does is to use it as material, which it does whatever it wills, with which it does whatever it wills. This is the typical function of the imagination, which always makes use of the familiar to produce the unfamiliar. What these remarks seem to involve is the substitution for the idea of inspiration, of the idea of an effort of the mind not dependent on the vicissitudes of the sensibility. It is so completely possible to sit at one's table and without the help of the agitation of the feelings to write plays of incomparable enchantment. That is precisely what Shakespeare did. He was not dependent on the fortuities of inspiration. It is not the least part of his glory that one can say of him, the greater the thinker, the greater the poet. It would come nearer the mark to say the greater the mind, the greater the poet, because the evil of thinking as poetry is not the same thing as the good of thinking in poetry. The point is that the poet does his job by virtue of an effort of the mind. In doing so, he is in rapport with the painter, who does his job with respect to the problems of form and color, which with respect to the problems of form and color, which confront him incessantly, not by inspiration, but by imagination, or by the miraculous kind of reason that the imagination sometimes promotes. In short, these two arts, poetry and painting, have in common a laborious element, which, when it is exercised, is not only a labor, but a consummation as well. For proof of this, let me set side by side the poetry and the prose of Proust. Taken from his vast novel, and the painting by chance of Jacques Villon. As to Proust, I quote a paragraph from Professor Sarrat. This is good stuff, man. Block quote. Another province he has added to literature is the description of those eternal moments in which we are lifted out of the drab world, the Madeleine dipped in the tea, the steeples of Martinville, some trees on a road, a perfume of wild flowers, a vision of light and shade on trees, a spoon clinking on a plate that is like a railway man's hammer on the wheels of the train from which the trees were seen, a stiff napkin in a hotel, an inequality in 2 stones in Venice, and the disjointment in the yard of the Guermantes townhouse. As to Villon, shortly before I began to write these notes, I dropped into the Carré Gallery in New York to see an exhibition of paintings which included about a dozen works by him. I was immediately conscious of the presence of the enchantments of intelligence in all his prismatic material. A woman lying in a hammock was transformed into a complex of planes and tones, radiant, vaporous, exact. A teapot and a cup or two took their places in a reality composed wholly of things unreal. These works were délicieux, of the spirit, as distinguished from délectations, of the senses. And this was so because one found in them the labor of calculation, the appetite for perfection. It's end of section 2. I think section 3 is the final one. I'm just gonna... I think I can get through this whole thing. This is really good. I could add stuff right now because I'm having thoughts, but I don't think I could add anything as good as what Stevens is saying. Yeah, okay. Maybe I'll have to adjourn actually, because I hear my son stirring. I'll try to continue. Oh, he's waking up. Okay. That's it for now. I guess I'll record later. I'll glue the clips together.
All right, 24 hours has gone by, and it is now All Saints Day. You see, if I can knock out the final 2 sections of this essay, just about 10 more pages, I think. And then some thoughts have been percolating. So let me try to do all that. Now in my office, by the way, and I am, as you can tell, Razé. One of the characteristics of modern art is that it is uncompromising. In this, it resembles modern politics, and perhaps it would appear on study, including a study of the rights of man and of women's hats and dresses, that everything modern, or possibly merely new, is, in the nature of things, uncompromising. It is especially uncompromising in respect to precinct. One of the de Goncourts said that nothing in the world hears as many silly things said as a picture in a museum. And in thinking about that remark, one has to bear in mind that in the days of the de Goncourts, I don't know who that is, someone can fill me in, there was no such thing as a museum of modern art, a really modern definition of modern art. Instead of making concessions, fixes limits which grow smaller and smaller. Sorry. As time passes, and more often than not, come to include one man alone, just as if there should be scrawled across the facade of the building in which we now are the words Cézanne Delaunay. Okay, I guess Cézanne's museum. Another characteristic of modern art is that it is plausible. It has a reason for everything. Even the lack of a reason becomes a reason. So it's the whole notion of literature, i.e. interpretation, being the enemy of art. Okay. And by those lights, literature itself being the enemy of literature. Picasso expresses surprise that people should ask what a picture means, and says that pictures are not intended to have meanings. This explains everything. Still another characteristic of modern art is that it is bigoted. Every painter who can be defined as a modern painter becomes, by virtue of that definition, a free man of the world of art, and hence the equal of any other modern painter. Here's the cover, by the way. It's a really nice old cover. Necessary Angel. we recognize that they differ one from another, but in any event, they are not to be judged except by other modern painters. So someone posted this reality show to the Discord. It's really terrible reality show about the Sucklord and all these strange and terrible artists who regrettably think so much of themselves, and are encouraged to do so. More on that maybe in a second. Let me stop interrupting myself and just read the rest of this. We have this inability, not mere unwillingness, to compromise. This same plausibility and bigotry in modern poetry. To exhibit this, let me divide modern poetry into two classes. One that is modern in respect to what it says, the other that is modern in respect to form. The first kind is not interested primarily in form. The second is. The first kind is interested in form, but it accepts a banality of form as incidental to its language. Its justification is that in expressing thought or feeling in poetry, the purpose of the poet must be to subordinate the mode of expression that, while the value of a poem as a poem depends on expression, it depends primarily on what is expressed. Whether the poet is modern or ancient, living or dead, is, in the last analysis, a question of what he's talking about. Whether of things modern or ancient, living or dead. The counterpart of Villon in poetry, writing as he paints, would concern himself with like things, but not necessarily confining himself to them, creating the same sense of aesthetic certainty, the same sense of exquisite realization, and the same sense of being modern and living. One sees a good deal of poetry, thanks perhaps to Mallarmé's Un coup d'adès, in which the exploitation of form involves nothing more than the use of small letters for capitals, eccentric line endings, too little or too much punctuation, and similar aberrations. These have nothing to do with being alive. They have nothing to do with the conflict between the poet and that of which his poems are made. They are neither bonne soupe or beau langage. Stevens gleefully drops references to things I'm not so familiar with, but maybe that's all for the good, all to the good. Look these things up later, I suppose. Or Paul Talk can educate me into the ways of, into the wild and woolly ways of Francophilism. What I have said of both classes of modern poetry is inadequate as to both. As to the first, which permits a banality of form, it is even harmful, as suggesting that it possesses less of the artifice of the poet than the second. I'm going to pause till I understand that. Okay, so Stephen's point there is something like what Paul Talk always says about classical realism. The classical realism, by using canvases and classical subjects, presumes to say something substantial just by virtue of the fact that it's using a certain banality of form, as Stevens might say, and the poet likewise, someone who writes a sonnet, just and presumes just by virtue of the fact that they have cohered to a certain rhyme scheme and a classical meter, has thus said anything of import. Those are to be regarded in the same category as the one who thinks by some kind of novel arrangement of form, writing in a wacky font with wacky line endings, and so on, to say something. The sort of the optical, in the one case, in the whatever you might say. Anyway, first things, the conservative rag, which publishes poems in the banality of form, is what springs to mind. But I won't go down that alley right now. These two classes are intransigent. Each of these two classes is intransigent as to the other. If one is disposed to think well of the class that stands on what it has to say, one has only to think of Gide's remark, quote, without the unequaled beauty of his prose, who would continue to interest himself in Bossuet? The division between the two classes, the division, say, between Valerie and Apollinaire, is the same division into factions that we find everywhere in modern painting. But aesthetic creeds, like other creeds, are the certain evidences of exertions to find the truth. I have tried to say no more than was necessary to evince the relations in which we are interested, as they exist in the manifestations of today. What, when all is said and done, is the significance of the existence of such relations? Or is it enough to note them? The question is not the question is not the same as the question of the significance of art. We do not have to be told of the significance of art. It is art, said Henry James, which makes life, makes interest, makes importance, ... and I know of no substitute whatever for the force and beauty of its process, end quote. The world about us would be desolate except for the world within us. There is the same interchange between these two worlds as that there is between one art and another. Migratory passings, to and fro, quickenings, Promethean liberations, and discoveries. Okay. It may be that just as the senses are no respecters of reality, so the faculties are no respecters of the arts. On the one hand, it may be that we are dealing with something that has no significance, something that is the result of imitation. Quartemire de Quincy distinguished between the poet and the painter as between two imitators, one moral, the other physical. There are imitations within imitations, and the relations between poetry and painting may present nothing more. This idea makes it possible, at least, to see more than one side of the subject. Section 4, final section, I think. All of the relations of which I have spoken are themselves related in the deduction that the vis poetica, the power of poetry, leaves its mark on whatever it touches. The mark of poetry creates the resemblance of poetry as between the most disparate things and unites them all in its recognizable virtue. There is one relation between poetry and painting which does not participate in the common mark of common origin. It is the paramount relation that exists between poetry and people in general, and between painting and people in general. I have not overlooked the possibility that, when this evening's subject was suggested, it was intended that the discussion should be limited to the relations between modern poetry and modern painting. This would have involved much tinkling of familiar symbols, cymbals, playing on words. Wallace Stevens, the poet. It is, insofar as it would have called for a comparison of this poet or that painter, this school and that school, it would have been fragmentary and beyond my competence. It seems to me that the subject of modern relations is best to be approached as a whole. The paramount relation between poetry and painting today, between modern man and modern art, is simply this: that in an age in which disbelief is so profoundly prevalent, or if not disbelief, indifference to questions of belief, poetry and painting and the arts in general are, in their measure, a compensation for what has been lost. Men feel that the imagination is the next greatest power to faith, the reigning prince. Consequently, their interest in the imagination and its works is to be regarded not as a phase of humanism, but as a vital self-assertion in a world in which nothing but the self remains, if that remains. So regarded, the study of the imagination and the study of reality come to appear to be purified, aggrandized, fateful. So, yes, how much stature, even vatic stature, this conception gives the poet. He need not exercise this dignity in vatic works. How much authenticity, even Orphic authenticity, it gives to the painter. He need not display this authenticity in Orphic works. It should be enough for him that to which he has given his life should be so enriched by such an access of value. Poet and painter alike live and work in the midst of a generation that is experiencing essential poverty in spite of fortune. The extension of the mind beyond the range of the mind, the projection of reality beyond reality, the determination to cover the ground, whatever it may be, the determination not to be confined to the recapture of excitement and intensity of interest, the enlargement of the spirit at every time and every way. These are the unities, the relations to be summarized as paramount now. It is not material whether these relations exist consciously or unconsciously. One goes back to the coercing influences of time and place. It is possible to be subjected to a lofty purpose and not to know it. But I think that most men of any degree of sophistication, most poets, most painters, know it. When we look back at the time, at the period of French classicism in the 17th century, we have no difficulty in seeing it as a whole. It is not so easy to see one's own time that way. Pretty much all of the 17th century, in France at least, can be summed up in one word, in that one word: classicism. The paintings of Poussin, Claude's contemporary, are the inevitable paintings of the generation of Racine, the poet. If it has been a time when dramatists used the detailed scene directions that we expect today, the directions of Racine would have left one wondering whether one was reading the descriptions of a scene or the description of one of Poussin's works. The practice confined them to the briefest generalization. Thus, after the list of persons in King Lear, Shakespeare added only two words: scene, Britain. Yet even so, the directions of Racine, for all their brevity, suggest Poussin, that a common quality is to be detected in such simple things, exhibits the extent of the interpretation persuasively. The direction of Britannicus is: the scene is at Rome, in a chamber of the palace of Nero. For Iphigenie and Aulide, this is a scene in Racine, the scene is at Aulis, before the tent of Agamemnon. For Phaedra, the scene is at Razé, a town of the Peloponnesus. For Esther, the scene is at Susa, in the palace of Assorus. And for Athalie, the scene is in the Temple of Jerusalem, in a vestibule of the apartment of the Grand Priest. At St. John's, they made us translate Racine, and never felt like I got as into it as maybe I now might want to. Clearly, my French knowledge is not very far up to snuff. But the point here he's making is interesting, I think. Onward. Okay. Our own time, and by this I mean the last 2 or 3 generations, including our own, can be summed up in a way that brings into unity an immense number of details by saying of it that it is a time in which the search for the supreme truth has been a search in reality, or through reality, or even a search for some supremely acceptable fiction. Juan Gris began some notes on his painting by saying, quote, "The world from which I extract the elements of reality is not visual but imaginative." The history of this attitude in literature, and particularly in poetry in France, has been traced by Marcel Raymond in his From Baudelaire to Surrealism. I say particularly in poetry because there are associated with it the names of Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Mallarmé, and Valéry. In painting, its history is the history of modern painting. Moreover, I say in France because in France, the theory of poetry is not abstract as it so often is with us, when we have any theory at all, but is a normal activity of the poet's mind in surroundings where it must engage in such activity or be extirpated. Thus, necessity develops an awareness and a sense of fatality which gives to poetry values not to be reproduced by indifference and chance. To the man who is seeking the sanction of life in poetry, the namby-pamby is an intolerable dissipation. The theory of poetry, that is to say, the total of the theories of poetry, often seems to become in time a mystical theology, or more simply a mystique, a fashion, I'd say. The reason for this must by now be clear. The reason is the same reason why the pictures in a museum of modern art are often seem to become in time a mystical aesthetic, a prodigious search of appearance, as if to find a way of saying and of establishing all things, whether below or above appearance, are one, and that it is only through reality in which they are reflected, or it may be joined together, that we can reach them. Under such stress, reality changes from substance to subtlety, a subtlety in which it was natural for Cézanne to say, "I see planes bestriding each other, and sometimes straight lines seem to me to fall," or planes in color, the colored area, where shimmer the souls of the planes, and the blaze of the kindled prism, the meeting of planes in sunlight. The conversion of our Lumpenwelt went far beyond this. Lumpenwelt, I'd like to know what that means. Conversion of our Lumpenwelt, I guess there's a lumping of planes, went far beyond this. It was from the point of view of another subtlety that Klee could write. Quote, "But he is often chosen that today comes near to the secrets. Their original law fosters all evolution. And what artist would not establish himself there where the organic center of all movement in time and space, which he calls the mind or heart of creation, determines every function?" Conceding that this sounds a bit like sacerdotal jargon, that is not too much to allow to those who have helped to create a new reality, a modern reality, since what has been created is nothing less. This reality also, the momentous world of poetry, its instantaneities. Its instantaneities are the familiar intelligence of poets, although it has been the intelligence of another ambiance. Simone Weil, in La Peinture et la Grâce, Grace, what does that mean? The peasants of, has a chapter on what she calls decreation. Sounds like desecration. She says that decreation is making pass from the created to the uncreated. But that destruction is making pass from the created to nothingness. Modern reality is a reality of decreation, in which our revelations are not the revelations of belief, but the precious portents of our own powers. The greatest truth we could hope to discover in whatever field we discovered is that man's truth is the final resolution of everything. Poets and painters alike today make that assumption, and this is what gives them the validity and serious dignity that become them as among those that seek wisdom, seek understanding. I am elevating this a little, because I am trying to generalize, and because it is incredible that one should speak of the aspirations of the last 2 or 3 generations without a degree of elevation. Sometimes it seems the other way. Sometimes we hear it said that in the 18th century there were no poets, and that the painters, Chardin, Fragonard, Watteau, were elegantes and nothing more. That in the 19th century the last great poet was the man that looked most like one, and that the whole Pierian sodality had better have been fed to the dogs. It occasionally seems like that today, and must seem as it may. In the logic of events, the only wrong would be to attempt to falsify the logic to be disloyal to the truth. It would be tragic not to realize the extent of man's dependence on the arts. The kind of world that might result from too exclusive a dependence on them has been questioned. The kind of world that might result from too exclusive a dependence on them has been questioned. As if the discipline of the arts was in no sense a moral discipline. We have not to discuss that here. It is enough to have brought poetry and painting into relation as sources of our present conception of reality, without asserting that they are the sole sources, and as supports of a kind of life, which it seems to be worth living with their support, even if doing so is only a stage in the endless study of an existence, which is the heroic subject of all study. That's the end. I was getting a little hazy-headed as I went through that point about Chardin, Fragonard, and Watteau. Let me just look at that one more time in the Say system. Elegance. I don't quite know what he means when it says that we're in a similar situation today. Writing, what year would this have been? What year was this published? Copyright 1942. Okay. At the last, whatever, how Steve Bannon would put it, the last turning of the screw, the 80-year increments that allegedly organize history. Okay. Steady my chair. I have a chair on top of a table. And on top of the table I have books that prop up my phone. This is my office. This is my piano. I won't give a tour right now, but I'm sitting here, and if you'll excuse the cringe factor, I'm gonna take a few pipes from my virtual cigarette. Much easier on the lungs. Sam Hyde's moved over to vaping, so why not me too? Why not me too? Okay, but so what's being said here is seems vitally important to me. And also very suited to some kind of, to my channel, given that my channel is more or less a kind of long correspondence of Paul Talk. Who has finally kind of been able to make me see some things and bring me more into his mind than in the past, and something I'll try to talk about. Not that I'm, not that there still aren't areas of difference, perhaps, but there's more overlap I'm now seeing than there ever was. In part because, as a consequence of me challenging Paul, I think, which I think was necessary for him to show me stuff. But I've been doing a whole lot of writing, which I won't go into now, subject matter-wise, but if anyone wants to check out my latest piece, I'm going to start putting things on Medium at cxejohns.medium.com. I'm working right now on a long essay about a BLM controversy that's touching my alma mater of St. John's College. And it's kind of an essay in defense of essays, as a literary form, as against articles, bite-sized, consumable meal replacements to actual thinking. The opinionification of literature as the enemy of literature, or as Jack Handey once said Jack Handey may be the last great writer for the New Yorker. Said in an interview once, a wild fox roaming through the snow, and then he saw his mortal enemy, the fox. But so yes, this sort of this correspondence between painting and poetry, being that they both involve composition, and involve more engagement with reality than their proprietors and proprietoresses that their marketing madmen would have us think, would have us believe. So Paul's fond of often saying that that painting got hit first, because when painting goes bad, bridges don't fall down. Right? It's a remark that's provocative, but it occurs to me now deserves a bit of unpacking and further explication in relation to poetry, since poetry, being being a literary expression, albeit a not a didactic one, typically, although the native school of English poets, which St. Thomas More might have ranked among, prior to the Italian Romantic Petrarchan influences that so enamored the English during the Renaissance and forced poetry into a more ornate, words for words' sake style of the fashion of taking hold. And Shakespeare's kind of said this is neither here nor there, but but poetry being something concerned with words and thus with meanings, and although not didactic itself, because poetry is the most the most sort of pure exercise of the linguistic faculty, having a relationship with any kind of writing, and thus any kind of thinking. So any kind of anything that one might say in a discussion, be it literary or political or whatever it might be, the ability to craft an argument or to say what one means, just the discourse itself, public discourse itself, as a rough what's the word, as an expression of the poetic, as an expression of the poetic. So proxy is the word I was looking for, as a proxy of the poetic. Or vice versa. So that, just to sort of explain Paul's alarm at the destruction of art and why that could eventually lead to the collapse of bridges, the dialectical line of reasoning goes something like, okay, so people destroy painting thinking it doesn't matter. They can just use it, as Wallace Stevens seems to say, as a kind of pseudo-religion. That when people stop believing in God, they start to invest the human imagination and modern art with all of the import of their of their human frailty, and they begin to look to it with this sort of quasi-religious zeal. That in turn affecting the world of poetry, which becomes a kind of discombobulated farce, a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, and sort of like well-intentioned traditionalistic Christian reactions to that in the form of, he calls this, this adherence to the banality of form, i.e. the sort of the classical realist optical movement in painting, or sort of like the return to poetic form for poetic form's sake, not which misses the boat of what painting and poetry are really about, which are imaginative expressions of the real. So, hence Wallace Stevens' title, this book, The Necessary Angel essays on imagination and reality. His essay really makes me want to reapproach his poetry, even though I've had a hard time with it in the past, to see what's really going on there. Frost is a lot easier for me, but I might make a sally forth. So anyway, happy All Saints Day, by the way, to anybody watching. It's getting a little long, but I guess I'll just conclude by saying that, you know, when one puts pen to paper and thinks long enough, and expresses one's thoughts in words, it naturally forms like words into sentences and sentences into paragraphs. Paragraphs eventually form into an essay, I believe, if you write long enough. And so the truncation of that form into article length, into something more bite-sized and consumable, it's like the truncation of art into something, into a marketing product, into something optical. It's used to sell something rather than to truly show it. And so there you have, by a logical movement, the way in which discourse itself degrades, becomes commodified, and we no longer really are equipped with sufficient language and sufficient art to think, to explain things, to read, to listen, and clear thinking falls to the wayside, gets sold down the river. Enslaved. Slavery as a theme that should be meditated on, and Black Lives Matter as a kind of bodyguard, a bouncer at the club, keeping you, terrible analogy, but keeping you from talking about slavery, which is a theme well worth exploring in all of its manifold forms throughout history. So that's probably bad enough for now. I hope this has been interesting and useful to people as much as it has been to me.